This is a true story, but the names of the characters have been changed. I thought I knew everything about Sarah, the woman I'd planned my life with. But when Emily, an old flame, reappeared, subtle cracks began to form. Sarah's once trusting gaze grew sharper, sensing a hidden truth I hadn't faced myself. Every glance and moment of tension with Emily pulled me deeper into guilt. And as Sarah's questions became more pointed, I realized my secrets were on the brink of unraveling. Emily and I first met in the fall of our senior year at Harvard, amidst the vibrant reds and golds of the maple leaves that covered the Boston campus. The air was thick with the excitement of final year ambitions, and the season felt like a promise of the future we were all eagerly waiting to grasp. Emily was the best friend of Sarah, my new girlfriend. Sarah was warm-hearted and full of energy, her sincerity drawing me in from the very first few times we met in the student union. And when Sarah introduced Emily, the friend she had cherished since their first days in college, I could barely believe my eyes. Emily was the girl I had once loved deeply, a love I thought I had buried in the past. The moment my eyes met Emily's, memories of the days we had shared flooded back in vivid detail. We had first met as freshmen in a philosophy class we both took to fill our liberal arts credits. Emily had a quiet strength, a straightforwardness that set her apart from everyone else. Soon, those afternoon classes turned into long, unbroken conversations over coffee at nearby Cambridge cafes, where we poured out our dreams, fears, and private stories. It wasn't long before we became inseparable, and I knew, deep down, that she was my first real love. But life had other plans. By sophomore year, we both found ourselves swept up in endless study schedules, part-time jobs, and increasing pressure from our families. The relationship began to fray, not because the feelings faded, but because we were both too young to know how to hold on to love when life started shifting. Our breakup was quiet and mutual, and I told myself that time would eventually fade those memories. Yet, standing in front of Emily now, all of those memories returned with an unexpected force. She greeted me with a calm smile that almost surprised me. Her eyes, however, held a flicker of something familiar, a wave that seemed barely contained beneath her composed surface. Emily looked more mature, elegant, in a way that hinted at growth and resilience, yet still carrying that gentle warmth I remembered so well. Sarah, blissfully unaware of our past, chatted excitedly about their old college memories, making my heart feel unexpectedly heavy. I tried to remind myself that everything between Emily and me belonged in the past, that I now had Sarah and a different future ahead of me. But convincing myself grew harder with each gathering. Every time I saw her, in these shared get-togethers, each glance at Emily felt like pulling on a thread that led back to a time I thought I had moved beyond. And with each encounter, I knew that keeping my distance and hiding my feelings would only get harder. Despite my efforts to keep a distance and convince myself that everything with Emily was firmly in the past, seeing her regularly at group gatherings with Sarah made it impossible to avoid feeling uneasy. These meetups always seemed to fall on Friday nights, with our friends gathering at a cozy bar tucked away in downtown Boston, a familiar place for the whole group since our college days. Sarah, always cheerful and carefree, often pulled both Emily and me into conversations about old memories. She had no idea that each mention of the past made me feel a weight pressing down on me. In the dim lighting of the bar, my eyes sometimes wandered toward Emily, despite my attempts to focus elsewhere. She remained as reserved and composed as ever, listening quietly, sometimes with a gentle smile on her face. But in fleeting moments when our eyes met, I felt a rush of memories, a reminder of days when we were both filled with dreams and ambition. Our relationship had ended long ago, but time hadn't fully erased the emotions I once felt for her. Just seeing Emily brought me back to those cold Boston nights when we sat together, sharing our innermost thoughts. Sarah frequently invited Emily to our gatherings, and Emily, not wanting to refuse her best friend, always joined us with a natural, pleasant demeanor. I knew it couldn't be easy for her either. There was an unspoken effort in the way she interacted, and I noticed the slight awkwardness in her gaze when we happened to exchange a glance. We used to understand each other so well that even now, in these quiet moments, there seemed to be an unvoiced connection between us. Inside me, a nameless conflict began to grow. I loved Sarah. She was the source of comfort and calm that I had sought for so long. But Emily's presence stirred something deeper, something unresolved. Each meeting only added to that quiet turmoil, making me feel as though I were betraying both Sarah and myself. Yet I couldn't confide in anyone. Everything about this was buried in the past, and I didn't want to hurt either of the two women who meant so much to me. Keeping my distance from Emily became an increasingly difficult challenge. Every time we met in Boston on these Friday nights, memories would flood back like an unstoppable current. The smiles, the stories, even the words we'd left unspoken, all of it came rushing back. But I reminded myself that silence was the only way to keep things intact. As Sarah's intuition and perceptiveness sharpened, she began to sense that something was off between Emily and me. Whenever the three of us were together at a gathering, I could feel Sarah's silent observations, her quick glances, and occasionally a subtle question that hinted at her growing suspicions. She had never doubted me before. Our relationship had always been built on absolute trust. But perhaps the silence between Emily and me, the fleeting glances and the moments of awkwardness, were starting to reveal a truth that Sarah had hoped would never exist. One time, during a gathering, Sarah was recounting a funny memory from her college days. Mid-sentence, she caught a quick, unplanned exchange of glances between me and Emily. Sarah paused, a flash of unease crossing her face. But instead of saying anything, she just smiled faintly and continued her story. From that moment, though, I noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. Her gaze grew more watchful, her presence more observant. Sarah's questions about my schedule, my busy days, and the times I'd spent with Emily seemed laced with a quiet urgency, as if she were piecing together a puzzle I didn't want her to solve. One evening, Sarah surprised me by suggesting a short trip and insisted that we invite Emily along. "It'll be fun to have my best friend with us," she said casually. I felt a sudden tension rise within me, but with no real reason to object, I reluctantly agreed. Throughout the trip, Sarah watched my every gesture with Emily carefully. There was a moment by the campfire when she suddenly asked Emily about the memories we'd shared in the past. Emily hesitated, glancing at me before carefully choosing her words. Sarah said nothing more, but her sharp gaze seemed to penetrate everything. After the trip, Sarah's questions about my work became more specific, and she caught me off guard one day by asking, "Do you ever miss Emily when she's not around?" I froze for a second, but managed to answer calmly. She looked at me, and I could sense a quiet disappointment, as if she had just confirmed something she didn't want to believe. One night, I woke up to find Sarah sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness. She wasn't crying, nor did she show any obvious signs of distress. She simply sat there, lost in thought, as if confronting something she couldn't control. I wanted to go to her to say something comforting, but the words caught in my throat. I knew I had placed Sarah in a world of doubt, where the peace she deserved had slipped away. A few days later, when I came home, Sarah looked at me with a determined expression and told me she'd arranged to meet Emily alone. "Just a friendly catch-up between two best friends," she explained with a cool, steady tone. I nodded, feigning composure, but a knot of anxiety tightened inside me. All night, I couldn't stop thinking about what they might discuss, whether Sarah would ask Emily the very questions I'd been dreading. When Sarah returned, she didn't say much, just gave me a small, cryptic smile, her gaze steely and resolved. After that day, she stopped mentioning Emily altogether, and she no longer questioned my work schedule or my interactions. It felt as though she was patiently waiting for me to admit something, or perhaps to let me walk straight into the trap she had set. Her silence weighed heavily on me, making every glance feel like a reminder of the truth I was struggling to keep hidden. Sarah was becoming more torn between the trust she had in me and the nagging fear that something was going on between Emily and me that she couldn't quite grasp. On countless late nights, I would find Sarah lying awake, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. Sometimes she would sit up in bed, resting her head on her knees, gazing into the empty space of our room, her face etched with worry and sadness. I'd hear her sigh deeply, as if wrestling with an emotion she couldn't contain or share, and it was a sound that made the guilt within me grow sharper each time. I knew that any attempt to reassure her would only make her suspicions rise. One night, seemingly out of nowhere, Sarah suggested that we take a short trip to reconnect. She said that we'd seemed distant lately, that maybe a getaway could bring us closer, like we used to be. I understood that Sarah was doing everything she could to salvage what was left between us, to keep our relationship intact. But deep down, I felt a pang of anxiety, knowing that no matter where we went, the feelings I held for Emily would still be there. Nevertheless, I agreed to her idea, hoping that maybe this trip would help me find clarity, and maybe, just maybe, allow me to leave the past behind. The night before we were set to leave, Sarah had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she finished packing. As I walked by, a string of messages between her and her best friend lit up the screen. In those messages, Sarah had confided that she felt something was off, and that she believed Ethan might be hiding something about Emily. Each word felt like a silent accusation, and a heavy weight settled in my chest. I realized that I had driven Sarah into an anxious loneliness that she didn't deserve. Not only had I hurt her, but I had pushed our relationship to a point where it seemed fragile, ready to break at any moment. The next morning, as we prepared to leave, I tried to act as naturally as possible, but I sensed that Sarah could feel something was off. During the trip, she talked more and more about our future together, about the life she envisioned us building. She spoke about a home, a steady life, and simple dreams that we once shared. Listening to her, I felt trapped in a spiral with no escape. Part of me wanted to respond to her hopes, to be fully committed to her. But another part of me couldn't let go of the conflicted feelings I still had for Emily. Throughout the trip, Sarah tried her best to create happy moments, but I could see the lingering doubt in her eyes. One evening, as we sat together on the beach, she leaned her head on my shoulder, yet I could feel the tension in her breathing. Even though she was trying to put on a brave face, I knew she was searching for something. A sign, a reassurance that my love for her was still intact. When our short vacation ended, despite all her efforts, Sarah seemed to realize that the distance between us hadn't faded. She didn't speak about her doubts again, didn't voice her concerns, but her eyes had a new coldness in them, as if she had accepted a painful truth she couldn't quite bear to face. And from the look in her eyes, I knew that soon enough, I would have to face the truth as well, that my time to make things right with her was slipping away, and there was nowhere left for me to hide. After the short getaway, I realized that instead of easing Sarah's doubts, the trip only seemed to make her more watchful and sensitive to everything around her. She didn't directly address anything, but her suspicion became something I could feel every day, woven into her subtle gestures and carefully worded questions. Every time I came home later than usual, Sarah would inquire with more detail about my schedule and the people I met, as if each answer I gave her was a puzzle piece she was trying to fit together. One afternoon, Sarah mentioned she'd be working late because of an important meeting. I breathed a quiet sigh of relief, thinking I'd finally have a quiet evening to unwind, free from the weight of her questions and the pressure building inside me. But not even an hour later, as I sat in the stillness of our home, I heard the lock turning. Sarah had come back earlier than expected. She didn't say much, just looked at me with a steady gaze before casually asking, as if in passing, what I'd been up to while she was out. Caught slightly off guard, I responded that I'd just been at home, reading and relaxing. But Sarah's scrutiny didn't end there. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, taking in every detail as if she were searching for something. A trace of evidence that could confirm her suspicions. I felt my pulse quicken, knowing she no longer took my words at face value. Instead, she was looking for answers in every small detail, every possible clue that I might not even be aware of. Another time, as I stepped out of the room for a moment to grab some water, I came back to see Sarah holding my phone. She quickly placed it back down when she noticed me, her face filled with a tension and disappointment she couldn't fully hide. We didn't speak about it, but in that unspoken silence, I knew that Sarah's trust in me was breaking, that her growing unease was consuming her, becoming something impossible to ignore. The tension reached its peak one evening, when Sarah abruptly suggested she'd be visiting her family over the weekend, and would be staying overnight. She said it casually, but I knew this was yet another test, a trap she was setting, to see what I would do in her absence. That night I sat alone in the dark, my thoughts racing, feeling as though I'd been backed into a corner, with no escape. I knew Sarah was waiting for something. One slip-up to confirm her suspicions, and though I'd done everything I could to hide it, I also knew that my tangled feelings for Emily weren't just going to disappear. I questioned how much longer I could keep pretending, as Sarah's gaze grew sharper with each passing day, her words carrying the weight of hidden questions. I felt like I was walking on a thin wire, with every step pushing her doubts closer to the surface. I knew her mistrust had reached a level that no reassurance could calm, and that soon, I'd have to face the consequences that were now inevitable. When Sarah left to visit her family for the weekend, I stayed behind in the apartment. I thought this would be a chance to reflect clearly on everything happening in our relationship. But instead, her absence only made me feel more empty, as though the silence in the apartment mirrored the growing distance between us. I tried to focus on work, watch a movie, even reread my favorite books. Yet no matter what I did, thoughts of Sarah and even Emily kept circling in my mind. On Saturday evening, just as I was preparing dinner, I received a message from Emily. She said she needed to talk and couldn't stop thinking about the recent times we'd been around each other. In that moment I felt a profound inner conflict. I knew that meeting Emily now would only complicate things further. But at the same time, I realized that my feelings for her had never truly disappeared, and it wasn't easy to say no when she wanted to talk. Finally, I decided to meet Emily at our usual cafe, hoping to sort out the feelings that had been weighing on both of us. As we sat across from each other, she looked at me with an expression full of emotions she'd clearly been holding back for too long. She admitted that our closeness recently had left her feeling confused, and there were times when she questioned if she should keep suppressing these feelings. Her words struck a chord deep within me, and in that brief moment, I couldn't deny the connection between us. However, when I returned home, a wave of guilt began to wash over me. I pictured Sarah's face if she ever learned the truth, and my heart felt torn. I knew I had crossed a fragile line between my past and present, and that this secret couldn't remain hidden forever. I wondered if I'd soon have to confront Sarah and tell her everything. Or would I continue to bury these feelings and let everything quietly fade into silence? A few days after returning, Sarah suddenly suggested that she wanted to host a small dinner to celebrate our time living together. Strangely, the only people invited were me and Emily. When I asked her why, Sarah simply smiled and said it was a special occasion for the three of us to bond as close friends. I sensed something unusual, but I couldn't bring myself to decline. That evening, Sarah prepared everything perfectly, from the wine to the carefully arranged dishes she knew I loved. She was cheerful, constantly chatting and recounting memories of her time with Emily, blending in anecdotes from the early days of our relationship. I could feel that Sarah was probing, looking for a reaction from either me or Emily, and every word she spoke seemed to carry a hint of scrutiny. When Sarah raised her glass for a toast, she looked directly at both me and Emily, her gaze seemingly analyzing our smallest reactions. The atmosphere became tense, and I felt as if everything was being laid bare under the bright lights. In that brief moment, I caught Emily's eye. A flicker of unease appeared before she quickly looked away. Sarah seemed to notice this but said nothing, simply smiling and continuing her stories as if nothing was amiss. As dinner wrapped up, Sarah suddenly pretended to feel tired and acted as though she was tipsy. She stood up, mentioning she needed a moment to rest, then left the dining room, leaving Emily and me alone in an uncomfortable silence. I didn't know what to say, but the quiet between us seemed to hold all the things we both understood, yet couldn't express. In that instant, I realized that Sarah had been observing everything from the beginning, and likely knew more than I'd imagined. After Sarah left the dining room, the tension between Emily and me became almost unbearable. We sat there in silence, an unmistakable sense of anxiety and unease filling the space. I knew Sarah was watching from afar, keeping tabs on everything, and that anything happening now could lead to consequences I wasn't ready to face. Emily glanced at me hesitantly, her eyes mirroring the fear and uncertainty that I was feeling too. Finally, Emily whispered that maybe she should leave early, but I asked her to stay, saying we shouldn't make things more awkward than they already were. We sat there in silence a while longer, neither of us saying anything, though the tension between us spoke volumes. I felt trapped in a decision with no escape. On one side was Sarah, who had trusted me wholeheartedly, and on the other was Emily, who still held a special place in my heart from the past. In that moment, Sarah unexpectedly walked back in. She looked at us with a piercing gaze, as if she had already figured out everything she needed to know. She sat down and started asking direct questions, probing into the details of the time Emily and I had spent together in the past, emphasizing every detail, as though testing both our reactions. I felt like I was being interrogated, and with each question Sarah asked, a heavier weight settled on my heart. After many restless nights, Sarah decided to set her final plan in motion, determined to uncover the truth. She rented a hotel suite downtown, meticulously arranging every detail so that both Emily and I would unknowingly cross paths there. That evening, I received a message from Sarah, saying that Emily was waiting for me at the hotel, and that there was something important she couldn't explain over the phone. The urgency in her text made my stomach twist, but I felt I had no choice but to go. As I walked down the hotel corridor, I spotted Emily heading toward the room Sarah had mentioned. We exchanged startled glances, confusion mirrored on both our faces. "You're here too?" Emily asked, her voice low and filled with worry. Neither of us could fully grasp what was happening before Sarah suddenly appeared, stepping out of the shadows with an unwavering, cold stare fixed on us. Sarah gestured for us to enter the room and shut the door. The room was dimly lit, creating an intense and claustrophobic atmosphere, as if everything had been leading up to this one pivotal moment. She didn't sit down. Instead, Sarah stood across from us, arms crossed, silently observing. The silence grew heavy, and I could feel Sarah's patience slipping with each passing second. After a few tense moments, Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice firm and laced with controlled anger. "How long were you two planning to keep this from me?" Her question sent a chill down my spine. Emily lowered her head, her eyes welling up as she struggled to hold herself together. I could see the tension and guilt etched on her face, matching my own sense of dread. I knew there was no way out of this situation. Sarah's questions started to flow, each one probing deeper. She recounted times I'd come home late, moments when I'd claimed things were purely coincidental, and instances when I'd avoided eye contact. Each question felt like a blade cutting through layers of memories I'd tried to bury. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, Emily broke down, admitting that I had been her first love, and that she had tried desperately to suppress her feelings to preserve her friendship with Sarah. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face, and in that moment, I realized there was no going back. Sarah stayed silent, her piercing gaze never leaving me, as if waiting for me to reveal my part in all of this. With no other option, I confessed the truth. That I'd never truly let go of my feelings for Emily, that I'd hidden it all in an attempt not to hurt Sarah. But now it was all too late, and I knew we had crossed a line from which we couldn't return. The silence in the room became suffocating as Sarah processed each word, her emotions like a simmering volcano on the verge of eruption. After I confessed everything, the room sank into a suffocating silence. Sarah stood there, her eyes a mix of pain, anger, and a deep disappointment I had never seen before. Emily looked down, her shoulders shaking as tears started to fall, while I stood frozen, feeling as if my entire world had crumbled around me. Sarah took a deep breath, as if trying to hold back the storm of emotions inside her. But when she looked directly at me, I could see the hurt in her eyes, as if she'd just been stabbed in the heart by the trust she'd placed in me all this time. "So, it was all just a lie, wasn't it?" she finally said, her voice shaky yet resolute. "Was the love you said you had for me just another lie?" I tried to say something to explain, but no words came out. I knew, at this moment, anything I could say would be meaningless. Sarah had given me her complete trust, and I had shattered it completely. Emily, with tears streaming down her face, tried to explain to Sarah. Between sobs, she told Sarah she had fought her feelings, tried to protect their friendship, but that everything had spiraled out of control. But Sarah didn't want to hear it. She turned to Emily, her voice cold. "Do you think I'd ever accept that apology? Both of you have betrayed me." At that moment, Sarah stepped over to the table, pulling out her phone and showing a series of messages and photos she had collected. Moments where Emily and I had met, messages we'd exchanged. I was stunned to realize she had known far more than I had ever imagined. Sarah gave a bitter smile, saying she had suspected for a while, but had tried to believe in me, trusting that love and friendship could conquer her doubts. "I want both of you out of my life," Sarah said, her voice cold but laced with pain. She stood up and walked slowly toward the door, her eyes never meeting ours again. I reached out, hoping for some chance of forgiveness, but she pushed my hand away, opened the door and left, leaving Emily and me standing there, frozen in despair. As she left, I realized I had completely lost any chance to make things right. Emily and I stood in that cold, empty room, looking at each other, but unable to say a word. Everything was broken, and all I was left with was the hollow realization that I had lost both the love and trust of the woman who had given me everything. When the door closed behind Sarah, an unbearable silence filled the room, pressing down on both me and Emily. We stood there, motionless, as if neither of us dared to disturb the heavy tension that lingered in the air. I saw Emily trembling slightly, her shoulders quivering, and although she avoided my gaze, I could sense the pain and emptiness we were both feeling in that moment. I tried to speak, but my voice came out weak and broken, as if I didn't even believe the words myself. "Emily, maybe we..." But Emily cut me off, her tear-filled eyes looking at me with raw, unfiltered sorrow. "There's nothing left to say, is there?" Her voice was soft but unwavering, carrying a sadness so deep that I knew I could do nothing to ease it. Emily lowered her head, struggling to hold back the tears that wouldn't stop falling. She took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to accept that everything we shared with Sarah had shattered beyond repair. I know we messed up, but I never thought we'd lose Sarah. She meant everything to me, and now, we've lost her forever." Her words cut into me, and the regret in her eyes mirrored the pain we were both enduring. With nothing left to say, we walked out of the hotel, descending the stairs slowly, each step dragging me deeper into regret and emptiness. Emily walked ahead, her figure disappearing into the crowd outside, as if trying to escape everything that had just happened. I stood there for a moment, watching her fade into the distance, realizing that we no longer belonged to each other, or to anything that had existed before. When I returned home, the space felt more hollow than ever. Gone were the sounds of laughter shared between Sarah and me. Gone was the warmth of the happiness we once shared. Every object, every corner of the apartment, reminded me of everything I had lost. I sat there alone, feeling as though I were trapped between the cold, lifeless remnants of the past and the weight of overwhelming regret. I knew Sarah had asked both me and Emily to leave her life. She needed space, a chance to heal from the pain we had caused her. But the hardest part was living with the knowledge that I had broken the hearts of the two women I had once loved most. I wondered if I could ever move past this, or if I would be forever stuck in this cycle of remorse and guilt. In that moment, I understood there was no forgiveness that could restore what we'd had. Everything was shattered, and now all that was left was myself, with only bittersweet memories and the lingering image of Sarah in my mind. After that confrontation, I felt as if I were suspended in a limbo, caught somewhere between past and present. Each morning, I woke up in the quiet, empty apartment, trying to tell myself I needed to keep going, yet feeling a hollowness deep inside. I wasn't myself anymore. All that remained was a shadow, existing without any sense of joy or purpose. Every day, I threw myself into work, using it as a means to avoid reality. But in the evenings, when I returned home, there was nowhere to hide. I'd sit in the darkened room, staring out the window as the city lights flickered, but they no longer brought the same peace they once did. Every person on the street below seemed to have a life moving forward, while I was left behind, trapped in regret and memories I couldn't shake. The memories of Sarah came flooding back. Every moment we'd shared was now a painful fragment embedded in my mind. I remembered the quiet weekend mornings, the walks we'd taken in the park, laughing as if nothing could come between us. But now there was only silence and a flood of unanswered questions. Could I ever forgive myself for losing someone like her? Emily had disappeared completely, just as she'd promised Sarah she would. There were no messages, no calls, and I told myself this was best for both of us. But sometimes, in my dreams, I'd see Emily's face, her expression filled with sadness and regret. Waking from those dreams, the loneliness weighed on me even more. Our mutual friends gradually drifted away too. Perhaps they'd heard what happened, or maybe they just didn't know what to say to me. I realized I hadn't just lost Sarah and Emily, I'd also lost the other connections that had once been integral to my life. It was like a web that had unraveled, leaving me as the lone thread, caught in the ruins, unable to escape. Sometimes, I wondered if one day, when enough time had passed, I might be able to look back without feeling this sharp pain. But for now, the memories and regret looped endlessly, trapping me in emptiness. I knew I had lost the most precious parts of my life, and that loss would forever be a part of me, impossible to forget. Our story closes with the image of Sarah sitting quietly by the window, gazing at the bustling streets below. The city lights shine brightly, casting reflections in her conflicted eyes. Once, Sarah had placed unwavering trust in love and friendship, believing that these profound connections could withstand any test. But now, she feels only an emptiness, as if all that once brought her joy has become distant memories, unreachable and fading. She sits there, trying to summon the strength to start anew. But every time she remembers the betrayal by the two people she trusted most, it feels as if her world has crumbled. She wonders if she will ever be able to trust again, or if she'll forever be trapped in this pain that she did not create, yet is forced to carry. Night after night, she sits by the window, the city lights serving as a harsh reminder of her loneliness, of the wounds that never fully heal. Can time really be a cure for everything, or does it simply mask wounds that will never truly fade? As for me, I can't stop thinking about Sarah, and the loss we've both endured. The long nights are filled with regret, and I wonder if I will ever find peace within myself. Or will I remain forever ensnared in the guilt and loneliness I've created? I know what I've done is unforgivable, yet somewhere, I still hope that someday, Sarah will find the happiness she deserves, even if it's without me. Our story concludes in remorse and unresolved questions. Perhaps time will ease the pain, and allow both of us to move beyond the past. Or perhaps these scars will remain, a lasting lesson about love and the trust that was shattered.